The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Riverside Military Academy as Sarah Martinez walked through the main gates for the first time. Her worn sneakers made soft sounds against the polished concrete, a stark contrast to the synchronized boot steps echoing from the parade grounds nearby. She clutched a small duffel bag containing her few possessions, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that revealed the small scar running along her left temple. At 19, Sarah looked younger than her age, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches with a slender build that seemed almost fragile next to the imposing stone buildings surrounding her. Her clothes were simple and inexpensive, faded jeans, and a plain white t-shirt that had seen better days. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another scholarship student trying to find her place in an elite institution. The Academy's admissions office had been her last hope after aging out of the foster care system. With no family connections and limited resources, the partial scholarship she'd managed to secure represented her only chance at building a stable future. What the admissions committee didn't know, what no one at the Academy could have imagined, was that Sarah Martinez was one of the most lethal operatives ever produced by the United States Navy SEALs. Her real name wasn't Sarah Martinez. That identity, along with her carefully crafted background, had been provided by a classified government program designed to give retired special operations personnel new lives after particularly sensitive missions. The woman walking across the Academy grounds had spent 5 years in the most elite unit within SEAL Team 6, completing operations in 13 countries that would never appear in any official record. The transformation had been thorough. Plastic surgery had softened her features and removed the most obvious scars from years of combat. Hormone treatments had helped her gain weight and develop a softer appearance. Even her fingerprints had been altered through a painful but effective procedure. To the world, Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez had died in a training accident 2 years ago. Sarah Martinez, quiet scholarship student, had been born from those ashes. As she made her way toward the dormitory, Sarah's trained eyes automatically cataloged potential threats and escape routes. The habit was so ingrained that she barely noticed herself doing it. She identified the Academy's security cameras, noted the blind spots, and memorized the layout of buildings and pathways. These reflexes, honed through years of operating in hostile territory, would take time to fade if they ever did. The dormitory lobby bustled with activity as students moved in for the new semester. Sarah noticed how the other students naturally separated into distinct groups. The military cadets stood straighter, their movements precise and purposeful. Their uniforms were immaculate, every button and badge positioned exactly according to regulation. These young men and women came from military families, many following in the footsteps of fathers and grandfathers who had served with distinction. Near the windows, a different group gathered around expensive luggage and talked about summer vacations in Europe. These were the children of politicians, business leaders, and old money families who saw the Academy as a stepping stone to influential careers. Their casual clothes cost more than most people earned in a month, and they carried themselves with the unconscious confidence that came from never having to worry about basic needs. Sarah belonged to neither group. She was among the small number of scholarship students, those who had earned their places through academic excellence or exceptional circumstances. These students tended to keep to themselves, knowing they were tolerated rather than welcomed by their wealthier classmates. "You must be Sarah Martinez," a cheerful voice said from behind her. Sarah turned to see a young woman with bright red hair and freckles approaching with a warm smile. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, your roommate. I've been looking forward to meeting you." Jennifer extended her hand enthusiastically, and Sarah shook it carefully, remembering to use a normal grip rather than the crushing handshake that had been second nature during her military years. Jennifer's friendly demeanor seemed genuine, and Sarah felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. "Thanks, it's nice to meet you too," Sarah replied, keeping her voice soft and uncertain as she'd practiced. Jennifer appeared to be one of the scholarship students as well, based on her practical clothing and the nervous energy that suggested she was also trying to find her place in this intimidating environment. "Come on, I'll show you to our room," Jennifer said, shouldering one of her bags. "Fair warning though, it's not exactly the Ritz. These old buildings have character, which is a nice way of saying the heating doesn't work great, and the walls are thin enough that you can hear everything happening next door." As they climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, Jennifer kept up a steady stream of chatter that helped mask Sarah's continued surveillance of her surroundings. She noted the locations of fire exits, the security measures on windows, and the general flow of foot traffic through the building. Old habits died hard, and gathering intelligence about her environment felt as natural as breathing. Their room was small but functional, with 2 single beds, matching desks, and a window that looked out over the academy's central quad. Jennifer had already claimed the bed near the window and decorated her side of the room with family photos and colorful posters. Sarah's side remained bare except for the standard academy handbook placed on each desk. "So what's your story?" Jennifer asked as she helped Sarah unpack her few belongings. "I mean, how did you end up here?" "I got in on an academic scholarship after my high school principal recommended me. My family couldn't afford a place like this in a million years." Sarah had rehearsed her cover story countless times, but she still felt a flutter of nervousness as she recited the carefully constructed lies. "I aged out of foster care last year and needed somewhere to go. A social worker helped me apply for scholarships, and this place offered me a partial ride if I maintained good grades. I'm hoping to study international relations and maybe work for the State Department someday." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd already worked for agencies that made the State Department look like a university debate club, and she'd done things in the service of her country that would give diplomats nightmares. But her new identity required new dreams, and Sarah Martinez would pursue them with the same dedication that Elena Vasquez had brought to her missions. "That's amazing," Jennifer said with genuine admiration. "I can't imagine how tough that must have been, growing up without family. You're really brave for making it this far on your own." If only she knew, Sarah thought. She'd jumped out of airplanes into hostile territory, infiltrated terrorist cells, and eliminated high-value targets in their own strongholds. But Jennifer's kindness touched something in her that she'd thought was buried too deep to reach. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to actually be the person she was pretending to be. Their conversation was interrupted by loud voices from the hallway outside their room. Through the thin walls, they could hear a group of male cadets talking and laughing as they moved their gear into nearby rooms. The voices were confident and boisterous, with the particular brand of arrogance that came from young men who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. "Looks like we got some fresh meat this year," one voice said, clearly intended to be overheard. "Did you see some of the scholarship cases they let in? That one girl in the lobby looked like she was about to cry just from walking through the front door." Another voice joined in with cruel laughter. "These charity cases never last long anyway. Give it a month before they realize they don't belong here and drop out. Saves everyone the trouble of having to pretend we're all equals." Sarah felt her jaw tighten involuntarily, and she had to consciously relax her hands before they formed fists. Jennifer's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger, but she seemed unsure how to respond to the casual cruelty. "Don't let them get to you," Sarah said quietly, placing a gentle hand on Jennifer's arm. "People like that usually have the most to prove because they've never had to earn anything themselves." But even as she offered comfort to her roommate, Sarah was filing away the voices and beginning to form mental profiles of the speakers. Years of analyzing enemy communications had taught her to extract maximum information from minimal input. These weren't just spoiled rich kids. There was a particular edge to their confidence that suggested they were used to being able to do whatever they wanted without consequences. The next few hours passed peacefully as the roommates finished settling in and prepared for orientation activities. Sarah had changed into the academy's standard casual uniform, khaki pants, and a polo shirt with the school crest. The clothes fit well enough, though she'd had to be careful to choose sizes that didn't reveal the lean muscle definition that years of elite training had carved into her frame. As evening approached, Jennifer suggested they head down to the dining hall together for dinner. The large room buzzed with conversation as hundreds of students gathered for their first meal of the semester. Sarah followed Jennifer through the cafeteria line, choosing simple foods and staying alert to the social dynamics playing out around her. The dining hall was clearly divided along the same lines she'd observed earlier. Military cadets sat in tight groups, their posture perfect even while eating. The wealthy civilian students clustered around tables near the windows, their conversations peppered with references to exclusive clubs and expensive pastimes. Scholarship students like Sarah and Jennifer found spaces where they could, often at partially empty tables or in the less desirable sections of the room. They found seats at a table near the back, and Jennifer immediately began pointing out different groups and explaining what she'd learned about the academy's social hierarchy during her pre-arrival research. Sarah listened with apparent interest while actually conducting her own assessment of potential threats and allies. Her attention was drawn to a table of male cadets near the center of the room. Their uniforms were perfect, their bearing confident, and their voices carried clearly across the dining hall. These were clearly the alpha males of their class, the ones who expected deference from everyone around them. Sarah recognized the type immediately. She'd served alongside officers who commanded respect through competence and honor, but these boys seemed to expect submission simply because of their family names or financial status. "See that table over there?" Jennifer whispered, following Sarah's gaze. "Those are some of the top military track students. Word is they all come from families with serious connections, generals, admirals, that sort of thing. They pretty much run the social scene here." As if responding to some invisible signal, several of the cadets stood up and began walking toward their table. Sarah felt every muscle in her body tense automatically, though she kept her expression neutral and continued eating her salad as if she hadn't noticed their approach. Well, the apparent leader said as the group reached their table. He was tall and broad-shouldered with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident smile that had probably gotten him out of trouble his entire life. "Looks like we have some new faces joining our little community." His eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl, though she'd certainly endured worse scrutiny from actual enemies. She looked up with what she hoped was appropriate nervousness, playing the role of an intimidated scholarship student meeting the campus elite for the first time. "I'm Bradley Morrison," he continued, extending his hand with theatrical politeness. "My friends call me Brad. My father is Admiral Morrison. Perhaps you've heard of him? He's currently stationed at the Pentagon, working directly with the Joint Chiefs." Sarah shook his hand briefly, noting the way he squeezed just a little too hard in an obvious attempt at intimidation. If he'd known what she was capable of, he would have understood how foolish that gesture was. She could have broken every bone in his hand before he could blink, but instead she pulled back with what she hoped looked like discomfort. "Sarah Martinez," she said softly. "Nice to meet you." Brad's smile widened as he picked up on her apparent submission. "Sarah Martinez. That's a lovely name. And where are you from, Sarah? What brings you to our prestigious academy?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Sarah recognized an interrogation when she heard one. Brad was clearly trying to establish her place in the social hierarchy, determine how much respect she deserved, and decide whether she represented any kind of threat to his position. "I'm from California originally," she replied, sticking to her cover story. "I'm here on a scholarship, hoping to study international relations." "A scholarship," Brad repeated, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made several of his friends snicker. "How wonderful that the Academy provides opportunities for the less fortunate. It's important to give back to the community, don't you think?" Sarah felt a dangerous heat building in her chest, the same cold fury that had served her well during combat operations. She'd killed enemies of the state with her bare hands, survived torture that would have broken most people, and completed missions that required her to become someone else entirely. She was not going to be patronized by some spoiled brat who'd never faced real adversity in his privileged life. But Elena Vasquez was dead, and Sarah Martinez needed to play her role perfectly. So instead of demonstrating exactly how much damage she could do to Brad and his friends, she nodded meekly and looked down at her food. "It really is generous of the Academy," she agreed quietly. "I'm very grateful for the opportunity." Brad's satisfaction was obvious as he gestured to his companions. "Allow me to introduce my associates. This is Marcus Webb, whose father runs the largest defense contracting firm on the East Coast. And this is Tyler Richardson, whose family has been serving in the military for 4 generations. We're all part of the Academy's elite military leadership program." Each young man nodded as he was introduced, their expressions ranging from amused condescension to barely concealed hostility. Sarah memorized their faces and names automatically, adding them to the mental files she was building on potential problems. "And who might you be?" Brad asked, turning his attention to Jennifer. "Another scholarship recipient, I presume?" Jennifer's face flushed again, but she managed to keep her voice steady as she introduced herself. Sarah felt a surge of protective instinct that surprised her with its intensity. She'd spent so many years focused on missions and objectives that she'd forgotten what it felt like to care about protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. "How charming," Brad said after Jennifer finished speaking. "It's wonderful to see such diversity in our student body. The Academy really is committed to helping those who need it most." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Sarah saw Jennifer's hands tremble slightly as she gripped her fork. These boys clearly thought they could say whatever they wanted without consequences, secure in their privilege and social position. Well, we should let you ladies get back to your dinner, Brad said with mock courtesy. I'm sure you have a lot of studying to do if you want to keep up with the academic standards here. The coursework can be quite challenging for those who aren't used to this level of excellence. As the group began to walk away, Marcus Webb turned back with a cruel smile. Oh, and ladies, if you ever need any help with your studies or adjusting to life here, don't hesitate to ask. We'd be happy to provide some private tutoring sessions. The implication in his words was clear, and Sarah felt the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. She watched the cadets return to their table, their laughter carrying across the dining hall as they undoubtedly shared their amusement at the encounter with the scholarship students. God, they're awful, Jennifer whispered, her voice shaking with anger and humiliation. Who do they think they are, talking to us like that? People who've never been told no, Sarah replied quietly, her voice carrying a hard edge that she quickly softened. But don't let them get to you. Bullies like that only have power if you give it to them. Even as she offered comfort to her roommate, Sarah's mind was already working on a different level. She dealt with enemies who threatened national security, but there was something particularly infuriating about watching entitled young men abuse their privilege to hurt innocent people. These boys had no idea who they were dealing with, and they just made the mistake of targeting someone under her protection. The rest of dinner passed without incident, though Sarah remained hyper-aware of the cadet table and their continued glances in her direction. She could feel them watching her, evaluating her, planning whatever came next in their campaign of intimidation. They clearly saw her and Jennifer as easy targets, vulnerable scholarship students who could be tormented without consequence. As they walked back to their dormitory, Jennifer was unusually quiet. The encounter had clearly shaken her more than she wanted to admit, and Sarah found herself fighting the urge to go back and demonstrate exactly what she thought of Brad Morrison's attitude. Try not to let it bother you too much, Sarah said as they climbed the stairs to their floor. Guys like that usually peak in college and spend the rest of their lives talking about how great they used to be. Jennifer managed a weak smile. Thanks. I just hope they leave us alone from now on. I really need this scholarship to work out, you know? I can't afford to have them make my life miserable enough that I want to leave. Sarah nodded understandingly, but privately she suspected that Brad and his friends were just getting started. She'd seen their type before in different contexts, and they typically escalated their behavior until someone forced them to stop. Unfortunately for them, they'd just chosen the wrong target for their games. That night, as Jennifer slept peacefully in the next bed, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about the young men who thought they could intimidate her. They had no idea that the quiet scholarship student they'd tried to humiliate was someone who'd spent years learning how to neutralize threats much more dangerous than spoiled military cadets. She'd retired from active duty to find peace and build a normal life, but some instincts were too deeply ingrained to ignore. If Brad Morrison and his friends wanted to play games, they were about to learn that they'd picked the wrong opponent. Sarah Martinez might be a harmless college student, but Elena Vasquez was still very much alive underneath the carefully constructed facade. The question wasn't whether she could handle whatever they threw at her. The question was how much of her real training she'd need to use before they learned to leave her alone. For their sake, she hoped they were smarter than they appeared to be, because the alternative wasn't going to end well for any of them. The harassment began the very next morning with what appeared to be a simple accident. Sarah was walking to her first class when Marcus Webb accidentally bumped into her while carrying a large cup of coffee. The hot liquid splashed across her books and backpack, soaking through to the notebooks inside and ruining hours of careful preparation. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Marcus said with exaggerated concern, making no effort to help clean up the mess. "I hope I didn't damage anything important. Though I suppose scholarship students can't afford very expensive supplies anyway." Several other cadets gathered around to watch the scene unfold, their barely concealed grins making it clear that this was no accident. Sarah knelt to gather her soggy papers, playing the role of the embarrassed victim while internally cataloging each face for future reference. "It's okay," she said quietly, her voice carrying just the right note of defeated acceptance. "These things happen." But as she looked up at Marcus's smirking face, Sarah was calculating exactly how many different ways she could incapacitate him without leaving permanent damage. The training never really left, and her mind automatically assessed his stance, identified vulnerable pressure points, and planned the most efficient sequence of strikes to neutralize the threat. Instead, She simply gathered her ruined belongings and hurried toward the nearest bathroom to clean up. Behind her, she could hear Marcus and his friends laughing about the clumsy scholarship girl who couldn't even navigate a simple hallway without making a mess. The pattern continued throughout the day. In the dining hall, Sarah's lunch tray was accidentally knocked over by Tyler Richardson, sending food cascading across her uniform and the floor. During afternoon study period, someone had filled her assigned study Corelle with shaving cream, forcing her to spend her free time cleaning up the mess instead of preparing for classes. Each incident was carefully designed to appear accidental while making her life increasingly difficult. The perpetrators always had plausible deniability, and any complaints would sound like paranoid accusations from a student who couldn't handle the pressure of elite academic life. Jennifer wasn't spared either. Her textbooks disappeared from her locker, only to reappear in the cafeteria dumpster covered in garbage. Her uniform was mysteriously soaked with water from a leaking pipe that somehow only affected her clothing. The message was clear: scholarship students weren't welcome, and resistance would only make things worse. Maybe we should report this to someone, Jennifer suggested that evening as they surveyed the latest damage to their belongings. Someone had entered their room while they were in class and filled their dresser drawers with honey, ruining most of their clean clothing. Sarah considered the suggestion while helping her roommates salvage what they could. In her previous life, she would have handled this situation with swift and decisive action. A few strategic demonstrations of superior capability would have ended the harassment immediately. But Elena Vasquez's methods weren't available to Sarah Martinez. Who would we report it to? Sarah asked practically. Everything they've done could be explained as accidents or pranks. We don't have any proof it's intentional, and complaining will just make us look like we can't handle normal college life. The truth was more complicated than she could explain to Jennifer. Sarah had recognized the pattern of escalating harassment immediately, and she knew it would continue until someone forced it to stop. The question was how to handle the situation without revealing capabilities that would blow her carefully constructed cover. Meanwhile, Brad Morrison and his crew were enjoying their campaign of psychological warfare. They'd identified Sarah and Jennifer as perfect targets, isolated, vulnerable, and unlikely to fight back effectively. In their experience, scholarship students either transferred out quickly or learned to accept their place at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The little mice are getting nervous, Tyler observed during one of their planning sessions in Brad's spacious single room. Unlike the cramped doubles assigned to scholarship students, Brad's family connections had secured him premium accommodations with a private bathroom and sitting area. Good, Marcus replied, lounging in an expensive leather chair his father had shipped from home. Maybe they'll get the message and save everyone the trouble of having to pretend they belong here. Brad wasn't satisfied with their progress. He'd expected the Martinez girl to break down or transfer out by now, but she seemed to be adapting to their harassment with disturbing resilience. There was something about her that bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. I think we need to escalate things, he announced to his friends. These charity cases are tougher than I expected. We need to send a clearer message about what happens when people try to rise above their station. The escalation came during the Academy's traditional Welcome Week activities. Each evening featured different social events designed to help new students integrate into campus life. Sarah had been reluctantly attending these gatherings at Jennifer's insistence, though she found the forced socialization exhausting after years of operating in hostile territory where everyone was potentially an enemy. The Thursday night mixer was held in the Academy's main ballroom, a grand space with crystal chandeliers and portraits of famous graduates lining the walls. Students mingled in small groups while faculty members circulated to welcome new arrivals and answer questions about academic programs. Sarah stood near the refreshment table with Jennifer, both of them nursing glasses of punch and trying to look like they belonged in the elegant surroundings. They'd managed to salvage enough clean clothes for the event, though their outfits were noticeably simpler than the designer dresses and expensive jewelry displayed by their wealthier classmates. Look at them, Jennifer whispered, nodding toward a group of civilian students whose parents had clearly spared no expense on their wardrobes. I feel like I'm wearing a costume from the clearance rack. Sarah was about to respond when she noticed Brad Morrison approaching through the crowd. He'd exchanged his usual military uniform for an expensive suit that probably cost more than most families spend on groceries in a month. His confident smile and purposeful stride suggested he had specific plans for the evening. "Good evening, ladies," Brad said with exaggerated courtesy as he reached their position. "You both look lovely tonight. I hope you're enjoying the festivities." His words were polite enough, but something in his tone made Sarah's internal threat assessment systems activate automatically. She'd heard that particular combination of courtesy and condescension before, usually from targets who were about to reveal their true nature. "Thank you," Sarah replied carefully. "It's a beautiful event. The Academy really knows how to make students feel welcome." Brad's smile widened at her apparent naivety. "Indeed they do. In fact, I was hoping you might join me for a dance. It's tradition for upperclassmen to welcome new students personally, and I'd hate for you to miss out on the full Academy experience." The invitation was phrased as a request, but his tone made it clear that refusal might have consequences. Sarah glanced around the ballroom and noticed that several of Brad's friends had positioned themselves strategically around the room. This wasn't a spontaneous invitation. It was a carefully orchestrated move in their ongoing campaign of harassment. "That's very kind of you," Sarah said, "but I'm not much of a dancer. I wouldn't want to embarrass myself in front of everyone." "Nonsense," Brad insisted, extending his hand with theatrical gallantry. "I insist. Consider it part of your education here. Learning to move in proper social circles is just as important as academic achievement." Jennifer shot Sarah a worried look, clearly recognizing the dangerous undertones in Brad's invitation. But declining might provoke an even worse confrontation, and they were surrounded by witnesses who would only see a polite young man asking a shy girl to dance. Against her better judgment, Sarah allowed Brad to lead her onto the dance floor. The string quartet was playing a traditional waltz, and couples moved gracefully around the polished wooden surface. To outside observers, it probably looked like a charming scene of campus social life. But as soon as they were away from the crowd, Brad's demeanor changed completely. His grip on her hand tightened uncomfortably, and he pulled her closer than proper dancing etiquette would suggest. When she tried to maintain appropriate distance, his hand on her back pressed firmly enough to prevent her from pulling away. "You know," he said quietly, his breath uncomfortably warm against her ear, "I've been watching you since you arrived. There's something different about you, something that doesn't quite fit with the helpless scholarship girl act." Sarah's pulse quickened, though not from fear. Years of training had taught her to recognize when a situation was about to turn dangerous, and every instinct was screaming that Brad Morrison was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, maintaining her cover identity even as she mentally reviewed the most efficient ways to disable an opponent in a crowded public space. "Oh, I think you do," Brad continued, his grip tightening further. "Most girls in your position would have transferred out by now, but you just keep taking whatever we dish out. That suggests either remarkable stupidity or hidden strengths. I'm beginning to suspect it's the latter." His free hand moved to rest on her lower back, lower than any gentleman would place it during a formal dance. When Sarah tried to step away, he used his superior height and weight to prevent her from creating distance. "The thing is," Brad whispered, "I don't like mysteries. And I especially don't like scholarship students who think they're too good to know their place. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to come with me to somewhere more private, where we can have a proper conversation about your future at this academy." The threat was unmistakable now, and Sarah felt the familiar cold clarity that had served her well during combat operations. Brad Morrison had just made the fatal mistake of assuming that apparent vulnerability equaled actual helplessness. "I think I'd rather stay here," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a subtle steel that made Brad's confident smile falter slightly. "I'm afraid that wasn't really a request," Brad replied, his grip becoming genuinely painful as he attempted to guide her toward one of the ballroom's side exits. "See, my friends, and I have been discussing your situation, and we've decided that you need some additional orientation to academy life. Consider this a learning opportunity." Sarah allowed herself to be guided a few steps toward the exit while rapidly calculating her options. In her previous life, she would have ended this confrontation in seconds, but Elena Vasquez's methods would expose Sarah Martinez's true identity. She needed a solution that would protect her cover while making it clear that she wasn't as helpless as she appeared. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice still soft but carrying an unmistakable note of command that made several nearby couples glance in their direction. "I need you to let go of me right now." Brad's eyes narrowed at the change in her tone, but his arrogance overrode any warning signals his instincts might have provided. "Or what? You'll file a complaint? Tell them the big bad cadet was mean to you? Nobody cares about scholarship trash, sweetheart. The sooner you learn that, the easier your life will be." His hand moved lower, and Sarah realized that subtlety was no longer an option. Brad Morrison was about to learn the difference between perceived weakness and tactical patience. "Last warning," she said, her voice barely audible but carrying absolute conviction. "Remove your hands and walk away." Brad laughed, the sound attracting more attention from nearby dancers. "You're in no position to make demands, little girl. Now stop making a scene and come with me quietly, or my friends, and I will make your life so miserable that you'll beg the administration to let you transfer." Sarah's response was swift, subtle, and devastatingly effective. She shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, changing her center of gravity in a way that gave her maximum leverage. Then, she applied pressure to a specific point on Brad's wrist, while simultaneously stepping on his foot with precise force. To anyone watching, it looked like she'd simply lost her balance and accidentally stepped on her dance partner's foot while grabbing his wrist for support. But Brad Morrison suddenly found himself in excruciating pain, his hand completely numb, and his foot feeling like it had been struck by a hammer. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry," Sarah exclaimed loud enough for nearby couples to hear. "I told you I wasn't much of a dancer. Are you okay?" Brad tried to maintain his composure, but the pain was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. His hand hung useless at his side, and he had to fight not to limp as he attempted to continue the dance. More importantly, he'd seen something in Sarah's eyes during those brief seconds that made his blood run cold. "Perhaps we should sit this one out," Sarah suggested sweetly, her voice carrying across the dance floor. "I'd hate to injure you further with my clumsiness." Unable to refuse without making a scene, Brad allowed her to guide him off the dance floor and back toward the refreshment table. His friends watched with confusion as their leader returned looking pale and shaken, clearly not the outcome they'd expected from his intimidation tactics. "What happened?" Marcus asked quietly as Brad rejoined their group, still flexing his numb fingers and trying to process what he'd just experienced. "Nothing," Brad replied tersely, his eyes fixed on Sarah as she returned to Jennifer's side and resumed her role as the innocent scholarship student. "Just a minor misunderstanding." But, privately, Brad Morrison was beginning to understand that he'd seriously underestimated his target. The girl who'd just disabled him with what appeared to be an accident possessed skills that didn't match her background story. More troubling was the look he'd seen in her eyes, the cold, calculating assessment of a predator evaluating prey. For the first time since beginning their harassment campaign, Brad felt a flutter of uncertainty. Sarah Martinez wasn't behaving like any scholarship student he'd ever encountered, and her response to his escalation suggested capabilities that shouldn't exist in someone with her supposed background. The rest of the evening passed without incident, though Sarah remained hyper-alert to potential threats. She'd managed to neutralize Brad's immediate aggression without blowing her cover, but she knew the confrontation was far from over. Men like Brad Morrison didn't back down from challenges. They escalated until someone forced them to stop. Later that night, as Jennifer slept peacefully beside her, Sarah lay awake considering her options. She'd come to the academy seeking a fresh start and a chance to build a normal life, but her past was proving difficult to escape. Brad and his friends represented exactly the kind of entitled bullies she'd hoped to leave behind, but their harassment was threatening both her own mission and Jennifer's future. The smart play would be to endure their abuse until they grew bored or found easier targets. Sarah Martinez was supposed to be vulnerable, isolated, and ultimately disposable. But Elena Vasquez had spent too many years protecting innocent people to watch Jennifer suffer because of cowards who abused their privilege. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Brad and his crew regrouped and planned their next move. They'd recognize that she wasn't as helpless as she appeared, which meant they'd either back down or escalate significantly. Given their personalities and the social dynamics at play, Sarah suspected they'd choose escalation. If that happened, she'd have to decide how much of her true capabilities to reveal in defense of herself and her roommate. The mission required her to maintain her cover, but some principles were more important than operational security. Brad Morrison and his friends were about to learn that they'd chosen the wrong target for their games, and the lesson might be more painful than they could imagine. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's last conscious thought was a tactical assessment of her opponent's likely next moves. She'd spent years anticipating enemy actions and preparing counters, and those skills would serve her well in this new kind of warfare. The weapons might be different, but the principles remained the same. Know your enemy, protect your allies, and never let aggression go unanswered. The cadets thought they were hunting a helpless scholarship student, but They'd actually cornered an apex predator who'd been trained by the most elite military unit in the world. Tomorrow would determine whether they were smart enough to recognize their mistake before it was too late. Brad Morrison's hands still ached the next morning, a constant reminder that his encounter with Sarah Martinez hadn't gone according to plan. He'd spent most of the night trying to convince himself that her defensive move had been pure luck, but the memory of her eyes during those crucial seconds suggested otherwise. There had been something calculating and predatory in her gaze that didn't match her scholarship student persona. "She's not what she seems," he announced to Marcus and Tyler during their morning strategy session in his room. "I don't know what her game is, but nobody moves like that without training." Marcus looked skeptical as he examined Brad's swollen fingers. "Come on, man. You're talking about some foster kid from California. What kind of training could she possibly have?" "I don't know," Brad admitted, "but I felt it. When she grabbed my wrist, it was like she knew exactly where to apply pressure for maximum effect. And the way she stepped on my foot wasn't accidental. It was surgical." Tyler sprawled in the leather chair, his expression thoughtful. "Even if you're right, so what? Maybe she took a self-defense class or something. That doesn't make her dangerous to us. We still have all the advantages here." But Brad wasn't convinced. His instincts, honed by years of competitive athletics and military training, were telling him that Sarah Martinez represented a genuine threat to their established order. She'd embarrassed him in public, made him look weak in front of his followers, and demonstrated capabilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about scholarship students. "We need to be smarter about this," he decided. "Direct confrontation isn't working, so we'll have to be more creative. I want to know everything about her background, and I want her isolated from any potential allies." The first part of their new strategy involved Jennifer Walsh. If they couldn't break Sarah directly, they'd destroy her support system and force her to face their harassment alone. Tyler took point on this operation, using his family connections to access Jennifer's financial aid records and academic history. Her scholarship is need-based and requires maintaining a 3.5 GPA, Tyler reported back. If her grades slip even slightly, she loses her funding and has to leave. And get this, she's already struggling with the advanced calculus requirement. One bad test score could end her academic career. Brad smiled for the first time since the dance floor incident. "Perfect. Marcus, I want you to make sure she has plenty of distractions during her study time. Nothing too obvious, but enough to disrupt her concentration and preparation." Meanwhile, Sarah was dealing with her own challenges as she tried to balance her cover identity with the increasingly sophisticated harassment campaign. The cadets had shifted tactics from crude physical intimidation to psychological warfare, and their new approach was proving more difficult to counter without revealing her true capabilities. Jennifer's textbooks kept disappearing at crucial moments, only to reappear in impossible locations that required extensive searching to recover. Her alarm clock was repeatedly reset to the wrong time, causing her to miss important review sessions and study groups. Someone had even managed to access her online course portal and delete several completed assignments just before their due dates. "I don't understand how they're doing this," Jennifer confessed one evening as she frantically tried to recreate a deleted research paper. "It's like they have access to everything. My room, my accounts, my schedule. How is that even possible?" Sarah knew exactly how it was possible. The cadets were using their family connections and institutional privileges to access systems and spaces that should have been secure. It was a sophisticated operation that demonstrated both intelligence and resources far beyond typical college bullying. "We need to document everything," Sarah advised, though she knew it would be largely futile. "Keep copies of your work in multiple locations, change your passwords regularly, and never leave your room unlocked even for a minute." But even as she offered practical advice, Sarah was conducting her own investigation into her tormentor's operations. Years of intelligence gathering had taught her how to observe without being noticed, and she'd begun mapping the cadets' routines, relationships, and vulnerabilities. Brad Morrison's father was indeed Admiral Morrison, currently serving as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. His influence extended throughout the military establishment and into the Academy's administration. Marcus Webb's family controlled a defense contracting empire worth billions, giving them significant leverage over institutional policies. Tyler Richardson came from old military money, with relatives serving in key positions throughout the Pentagon and Congress. Collectively, they represented a network of power and privilege that made them effectively untouchable through normal channels. Any complaints or accusations would be quietly buried, and the accusers would likely find themselves facing retaliation that could destroy their futures. But Sarah's investigation had also revealed weaknesses in their seemingly impregnable position. All three young men had histories of problematic behavior that their families had covered up through influence and money. Brad had been involved in a serious car accident that had been quietly settled out of court. Marcus had been accused of academic fraud at his previous school before transferring to the academy. Tyler had a sealed juvenile record that suggested violence issues in his past. More importantly, their current harassment campaign was creating a pattern of evidence that even their family connections couldn't completely erase. Security cameras, digital records, and witness accounts were accumulating despite their efforts to maintain plausible deniability. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered their next planned escalation. While conducting routine surveillance of their activities, she overheard Brad and his friends discussing something they called the final exam, a plan to corner Jennifer alone and create a situation that would either force her to submit to their demands or provide grounds for academic dismissal. The beauty of it is that she'll have no choice, Brad explained to his confederates. Either she cooperates with our tutoring sessions, or she fails the chemistry midterm and loses her scholarship. Once her roommate is gone, Martinez will be completely isolated and vulnerable. Sarah felt the cold fury that had sustained her through the most dangerous missions of her career. These entitled cowards were planning to use Jennifer as leverage against her, threatening an innocent girl's future to satisfy their need for dominance. It was exactly the kind of abuse of power that she'd spent years fighting against in much deadlier contexts. The plan they devised was sophisticated and potentially untraceable. Tyler would use his connections to access the chemistry department's test materials, allowing them to sabotage Jennifer's preparation while ensuring she had no way to prove the interference. Meanwhile, Marcus would create a series of distractions and emergencies that would prevent her from seeking help from professors or study groups. The final element involved isolating Jennifer in a vulnerable location where Brad could present his ultimatum without witnesses. They'd chosen the academy's old library building, a rarely used structure that was officially closed for renovations, but still accessible through service entrances that Tyler could unlock using his family's institutional access. Once we have her alone, she'll understand that resistance is futile, Brad concluded with obvious satisfaction. And her little roommate will get the message that scholarship trash doesn't belong in our world. Sarah had heard enough. The cadets had just crossed from harassment into territory that threatened genuine harm to an innocent person under her protection. In her previous life, such threats against civilian assets would have triggered immediate and decisive response protocols. But Elena Vasquez was officially dead, and Sarah Martinez needed to handle this situation without revealing capabilities that would compromise her carefully constructed identity. She needed a plan that would protect Jennifer while maintaining her cover, and she had less than 48 hours to implement it before the cadets put their scheme into motion. That evening, Sarah began her own preparations with a methodical precision that had made her one of the military's most effective operatives. She couldn't use the full range of her training without exposing herself, but years of improvisation in hostile territory had taught her how to achieve maximum effect with minimal resources. Her first priority was gathering intelligence on the cadets' operational security. She needed to know their communication methods, their backup plans, and, most importantly, their individual psychological profiles. Understanding how they thought and reacted under pressure would be crucial for manipulating the situation to her advantage. Brad Morrison was the leader, but also the most emotionally unstable member of the group. His need for dominance and control made him predictable, but also potentially dangerous if cornered. Marcus Webb was the strategist, careful and calculating, but ultimately cowardly when faced with personal risk. Tyler Richardson was the muscle, willing to use physical intimidation, but lacking the intelligence for complex planning. Each had weaknesses that could be exploited, but Sarah needed to be careful not to reveal too much knowledge about psychological manipulation techniques. Her counter-operation would have to appear accidental or lucky rather than the product of professional training. Jennifer remained unaware of the specific threat she faced, though Sarah had begun subtly preparing her for potential danger. Under the guise of general safety advice, she'd taught her roommate basic situational awareness techniques and escape protocols. Jennifer thought they were just being paranoid about campus security, not preparing for targeted assault. "You're really taking this stuff seriously," Jennifer observed as Sarah demonstrated how to identify and avoid potential ambush locations around campus. "I mean, it's good to be careful, but This is a military academy, not a war zone. If only she knew, Sarah thought. Some of the most dangerous situations she'd faced had occurred in supposedly safe environments, and institutional authority was no guarantee of protection against predators who knew how to manipulate systems to their advantage. The night before the cadets planned to spring their trap, Sarah received final confirmation of their timeline and methodology. Tyler had successfully obtained copies of the chemistry midterm and access codes for the old library building. Marcus had arranged for a series of false emergencies that would keep Jennifer's normal support network busy and unavailable. Brad had prepared his ultimatum speech and selected the specific location where he planned to corner her. Everything was in place for their final exam, and they were confident that their superior resources and planning would guarantee success. What they didn't know was that their target had spent the last week conducting counter-surveillance and preparing responses to every aspect of their operation. Sarah's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to prevent the cadets from springing their trap, she would allow them to proceed while ensuring that the outcome would be very different from what they expected. They wanted to isolate and intimidate a helpless scholarship student, but they were about to encounter someone with capabilities far beyond their comprehension. The key was timing and positioning. She needed to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment to turn their ambush into a demonstration of their own incompetence and malice. Too early, and they'd simply postpone the operation. Too late, and Jennifer might be genuinely harmed before Sarah could intervene. As dawn broke over the academy grounds, Sarah made her final preparations while Jennifer slept peacefully beside her, unaware that the next 24 hours would determine both their futures at the institution. The cadets thought they were about to eliminate a problem and assert their dominance over the scholarship students who dared to challenge their authority. Instead, they were about to learn that their chosen victim possessed skills and experience that made their privileged backgrounds irrelevant. The quiet girl from California was about to remind them that real power came not from family connections or inherited wealth, but from competence, courage, and the willingness to protect others regardless of personal cost. The trap was set, but not by the people who thought they were in control. Sarah Martinez was about to demonstrate why underestimating your opponent was often a fatal mistake, even in contexts where the stakes weren't literally life and death. Brad Morrison and his friends were about to receive an education in the difference between theoretical power and practical capability, and the lesson would be more memorable than anything they'd learned in their privileged academic careers. The chemistry midterm was scheduled for 3 o'clock in the afternoon, giving the cadets planned perfect cover for their operation. Jennifer had spent the morning in anxious preparation, completely unaware that her test materials had been compromised and that her afternoon would involve far more than academic evaluation. Sarah watched her roommates' growing anxiety with carefully concealed fury. Jennifer was a genuinely good person who'd never hurt anyone, yet she was about to be victimized simply because entitled bullies wanted to demonstrate their power. The injustice of it reminded Sarah why she'd joined the military in the first place, to protect innocent people from those who would exploit or harm them. "I can't find my chemistry notes anywhere," Jennifer said frantically as she searched through her backpack for the third time. "I know I put them in here last night, but they're just gone." Sarah helped her look, though she already knew the notes had been stolen as part of Marcus's sabotage campaign. "We still have an hour before the test," she said calmly. "Maybe you can review with someone else's notes, or ask the professor for clarification on the material you're uncertain about." But even as she offered comfort, Sarah was finalizing her own preparations. She'd spent the morning conducting final surveillance of the old library building, identifying access points, escape routes, and potential weapons that would be available if the situation escalated beyond verbal intimidation. Her phone was set to record audio automatically, and she'd arranged for backup documentation through methods that couldn't be traced back to her. Jennifer's growing panic was exactly what the cadets had planned. By the time she arrived at the chemistry classroom, she was already defeated psychologically, struggling with missing materials and sabotage preparation. Sarah walked with her to the academic building, providing moral support while scanning for signs of the cadets' movements. "You'll do fine," Sarah assured her friend. "You know this material better than you think. Just stay calm and trust your preparation." Jennifer managed a weak smile as she entered the classroom, completely unaware that her academic performance was the least important aspect of what was about to unfold. Sarah waited until the exam began, then made her way toward the old library building using a route that would keep her invisible to the cadets' observation posts. The abandoned structure stood at the edge of campus, its neo-Gothic architecture making it look more like a fortress than an academic building. Renovation scaffolding surrounded the exterior walls, providing perfect cover for anyone seeking to enter or exit without being noticed. Sarah had already identified 3 separate access points and confirmed that the building's security systems were offline for construction. Inside, she quickly located the room where Brad planned to corner Jennifer after the chemistry exam. The cadets had chosen well. It was isolated from foot traffic, had multiple exits they could control, and provided enough privacy for their intimidation tactics without risk of immediate discovery. What they hadn't considered was how those same features would work against them when their victim turned out to be someone with professional hostage rescue experience. Sarah positioned herself in an adjacent room where she could monitor the approach routes and intervene at the optimal moment. She'd calculated the timing precisely. Jennifer would finish her exam approximately an hour after starting, giving the cadets a narrow window to intercept her and guide her to their chosen location. The key was allowing them to begin their operation while ensuring they never gained actual control of the situation. The waiting was perhaps the most difficult part. Sarah had spent countless hours in similar positions during military operations, but those had involved clear enemies engaged in acts of war. These were privileged college students whose worst crime was abusing their social position to hurt innocent people. The temptation to simply disable them all and be done with it was strong, but maintaining her cover required more subtle methods. At exactly 4:15 p.m., Sarah heard voices approaching the library building. Through a crack in the door, she watched Tyler Richardson guide a confused and frightened Jennifer through the service entrance. The girl was clearly disoriented and struggling to understand why she'd been brought to this isolated location. "I really should get back to my room," Jennifer was saying as Tyler led her down the dusty hallway. "I have studying to do, and Sarah will be worried if I'm late." "Don't worry about your roommate," Tyler replied with false reassurance. "This won't take long. Brad just wants to discuss some opportunities that might help with your academic situation." Sarah felt her jaw clench at the obvious manipulation in his words. These cowards were using Jennifer's academic anxiety to lure her into a vulnerable position, exploiting her legitimate concerns to facilitate their assault. It was exactly the kind of predatory behavior she'd spent years fighting against in much deadlier contexts. Jennifer's confusion was evident as Tyler guided her into the predetermined room where Brad and Marcus were waiting. The space had once been a reading room, but renovation work had stripped it down to bare walls and concrete floors. A few pieces of construction equipment provided the only furniture, and dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through grimy windows. "Ah, Jennifer," Brad said with theatrical warmth as she entered. "Thank you for joining us. I hope Tyler explained that we wanted to discuss some academic opportunities that might be beneficial to your situation here." Jennifer looked around the empty room with growing alarm, finally beginning to understand that this wasn't the helpful tutoring session she'd been led to expect. "What is this place? Why did you bring me here?" "This is where we can have a private conversation without interruption," Brad explained, his tone becoming colder as he dropped the pretense of friendliness. "You see, Jennifer, we've been observing your academic performance, and we're concerned about your ability to maintain the standards required for scholarship continuation." Marcus stepped forward with a folder containing what appeared to be academic documents. "According to our information, you're already struggling with several courses, and your performance on today's chemistry exam was disappointing." The lie was smooth and delivered with authority, designed to make Jennifer question her own perceptions and accept their narrative. Sarah recognized the technique from interrogation training: establish dominance, create doubt, then present an impossible choice as the only solution. "That's not true," Jennifer protested weakly. "I mean, the exam was difficult, but I think I did okay. And my grades in other courses are fine." "Are they?" Tyler asked with mock concern. "Because our sources suggest otherwise. In fact, we have reason to believe you might be at risk of academic probation, which would certainly end your scholarship eligibility." Sarah watched from her concealed position as the 3 cadets closed ranks around her frightened roommate. They were using classic intimidation tactics, controlling the space, overwhelming her with supposed authority, and presenting false information as established fact. Jennifer was clearly terrified but trying to maintain her composure in an increasingly threatening situation. "I don't understand what you want from me," Jennifer said, her voice trembling but still defiant. "If there are problems with my academic performance, shouldn't I be discussing them with my professors or academic advisor?" Brad's mask of politeness finally slipped completely. Your professors aren't here, Jennifer. Your academic advisor isn't here. It's just you and us. And we're the only ones who can help you navigate this situation successfully. The implicit threat was now explicit, and Sarah saw Jennifer's face pale as she finally understood the true nature of her predicament. These weren't concerned upperclassmen offering academic assistance. They were predators who'd isolated her for purposes that had nothing to do with education. Let me explain how this works, Brad continued, moving closer to Jennifer until she was forced to back against the wall. You have two choices. You can accept our mentoring and guidance, which will involve private tutoring sessions and close supervision of your social interactions. Or you can continue struggling on your own until your inevitable academic failure forces you to leave the academy. Marcus opened the folder and spread several documents on a nearby sawhorse, creating an improvised desk. We've prepared a mentoring agreement that outlines the terms of our assistance. Sign it. And we guarantee you'll maintain the academic standards necessary to keep your scholarship. Sarah could see enough of the documents to recognize them as sophisticated forgeries designed to create the appearance of legitimate academic intervention. The cadets had invested significant time and resources in creating paperwork that would provide cover for whatever mentoring activities they had planned. Jennifer looked at the documents with obvious confusion and growing fear. What kind of mentoring? What would I have to do? Tyler stepped forward with a predatory smile. Nothing too demanding. Attend our private study sessions, limit your social contacts to approved individuals, and demonstrate appropriate gratitude for our assistance. Simple requirements for someone who understands the value of the opportunity we're providing. The euphemisms were thin disguises for their real intentions, and Sarah decided she'd heard enough. Jennifer was clearly terrified and on the verge of panic, while the cadets were escalating their psychological pressure toward whatever physical coercion they had planned. It was time to spring her own trap. Sarah emerged from her hiding place with carefully calculated timing, appearing in the doorway as if she'd just arrived in search of her missing roommate. Jennifer, are you in here? I was looking everywhere for you. The cadets spun around in surprise, their carefully orchestrated intimidation session suddenly complicated by an unexpected witness. Brad's face flushed with anger at the interruption, while Marcus quickly gathered the forged documents to prevent their examination. Sarah, Jennifer cried with obvious relief. These guys brought me here to discuss some academic issues, but I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Brad said firmly, recovering from his initial surprise. This is a private academic consultation. You need to leave immediately. Sarah entered the room with apparent uncertainty, playing the role of a confused student who'd stumbled into a situation she didn't understand. I'm sorry, I was just worried when Jennifer didn't come back from her exam. Is everything okay here? Her presence had completely disrupted the cadets' psychological dominance over Jennifer, and Sarah could see their frustration as they tried to reassert control over the situation. They'd planned for an isolated victim they could intimidate without witnesses, not a rescue scenario that threatened to expose their operation. Everything is fine, Marcus said with forced calm. We're just having a private discussion about academic opportunities. Jennifer can explain everything later. But Jennifer was already moving towards Sarah, clearly eager to escape the increasingly threatening situation. Actually, I think I'd like to leave now. We can discuss this another time if necessary. Tyler moved to block the exit, his earlier pretense of politeness abandoned entirely. I'm afraid that's not possible. We haven't finished our conversation, and there are important deadlines that need to be addressed immediately. Sarah's assessment of the situation shifted into combat mode as Tyler positioned himself to physically prevent their escape. The cadets had just escalated from psychological manipulation to physical restraint, crossing a line that justified defensive action under any reasonable interpretation of self-defense law. Excuse me, Sarah said politely, stepping between Tyler and Jennifer. I think there might be some confusion here. Jennifer, and I need to get back to our studies, so we'll just be going now. Tyler's response was exactly what she'd expected. Accustomed to having his physical size intimidate compliance, he reached out to grab Sarah's arm and force her aside. It was the perfect excuse for demonstrating defensive capabilities without appearing to initiate violence. Sarah's reaction was swift, precise, and utterly devastating. She caught Tyler's wrist in a grip that instantly numbed his hand, used his own momentum to send him stumbling backward, and somehow managed to make him trip over his own feet in a way that sent him crashing into a stack of construction materials. Oh my goodness! Sarah exclaimed with apparent horror. Are you okay? I'm so sorry. I just turned around, and you were falling. I tried to catch you, but I think I just made it worse. Tyler lay groaning among scattered tools and building supplies, his wrist throbbing, and his ego bruised even worse than his body. The other cadets stared in shock at seeing their muscle reduced to a whimpering heap by what appeared to be a clumsy accident. Brad's eyes narrowed as he watched Sarah help the apparently injured Tyler to his feet with exaggerated concern. Her defensive move had been too perfect, too precisely executed to be pure accident. But proving intentional action would be impossible when she'd appeared to be trying to prevent his fall rather than cause it. We should really get Tyler to the medical center, Sarah suggested helpfully. That looked like a nasty fall, and his wrist might be sprained. The suggestion effectively ended the cadets' ambush attempt. They couldn't continue their intimidation of Jennifer while one of their number required medical attention, and the presence of a witness had already compromised their operation beyond recovery. Their carefully planned trap had been turned against them by what appeared to be an unfortunate accident. As they helped Tyler from the building, Brad caught Sarah's eye for just a moment. What he saw there confirmed his growing suspicion that the quiet scholarship student was far more dangerous than she appeared. There had been nothing accidental about Tyler's fall, and the precision of her defensive move suggested training that didn't match her supposed background. This isn't over, he said quietly as they passed her in the hallway. Sarah met his gaze with apparent confusion. I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean. I hope Tyler's injury isn't serious. But underneath her innocent expression, Brad caught a glimpse of the cold calculation that had made her such an effective operative in her previous life. She was sending him a message as clear as any verbal threat: escalate further at your own risk. As the cadets departed to tend to Tyler's injuries and salvage what they could from their failed operation, Sarah guided Jennifer out of the old library building and back toward the safety of campus proper. Her roommate was shaken but unharmed, and the immediate threat had been neutralized without exposing her true capabilities. I don't understand what just happened, Jennifer said as they walked across the quad toward their dormitory. They said they wanted to help with my academics, but everything about that situation felt wrong. Trust your instincts, Sarah advised. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Those guys were clearly trying to manipulate you somehow. Jennifer nodded gratefully, but Sarah could see she was still processing the implications of what had almost occurred. The cadets' intimidation campaign had just escalated to attempted physical coercion, and there was no guarantee they wouldn't try again with better planning. That evening, as Jennifer slept fitfully after her traumatic afternoon, Sarah lay awake considering her next moves. She'd successfully disrupted the cadets' immediate plan and protected her roommate from assault, but the underlying problem remained. Brad Morrison and his friends wouldn't abandon their campaign simply because one operation had failed. They'd regroup and try a different approach. The question was how far she could push back without revealing capabilities that would compromise her carefully constructed identity. Today's intervention had been subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but continued escalation might require more direct action. Sarah Martinez was supposed to be a vulnerable scholarship student who'd gotten lucky when her tormentors made a mistake. But Elena Vasquez was still very much alive underneath that facade, and she was growing tired of watching good people suffer because of privileged cowards who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. The cadets thought they were dealing with someone they could intimidate and control through superior resources and social position. Tomorrow, they might begin to understand exactly how wrong they were about that assumption.